Hello, everyone. I'm Hanna. I'm the project manager of the Industry One. And before we start, I just really wanted to say thank you for taking the time to be here today. And yeah, I'll just dive into the agenda right away. So today, I will be giving you a brief overview of the Industry One and our purchasing practice metric, as well as the underlying data and report that we derive it from. And this will be followed by a moderated panel discussion where we're delighted to have Karen Diaz, who is the lead of responsible purchasing practices at Fairware, moderating a panel with Pradeepan Ravi, who is the programs lead at TIWW India, Lotta Amsén, who is the head of sustainability at Griesbeck, and Haroon Shamsi, CEO of Shaheen Industries. The panel will be followed by a Q&A session. For this part, please use the Q&A box to ask any questions you have. You can also vote questions on questions. So we see the questions that everybody here would like to have answered the most. And we'll make our best, do our best to get to as many questions as we can. But hopefully, yeah, there is some time. And this will be followed by some closing remarks. So the Industry One was initiated by the Ethical Trading Initiative, Fairware, and Cascale, formerly known as the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, to accelerate progress on social, commercial, and environmental issues in the garment and footwear sector. The Industry One was born of impatience and frustration with the pace of change in the industry and the belief in its potential to create lasting positive change on the lives of garment workers and our environment. We know that this can only be truly realized when the whole value chain works together, because only together we can raise the bar and promote a level playing field. With this purpose in mind, the Industry One developed a set of industry-wide metrics to measure progress on an annual basis and leverage action towards social, commercial, and environmental progress. The metrics featured are on wages, purchasing practices, and greenhouse gas emissions. We can not at all do this by ourselves. Sorry, next slide, please. Our partners are very involved, and as said, we can do it without them. And the metrics are created in collaboration with a number of partners, namely the three lead organizations, which I've already mentioned, ETI, Fairware, and Cascale, as well as our data partners who play a crucial role in creating these metrics. And these are the Better Buying Initiative, the Wage Indicator, Worldly, and the Apparel Impact Institute. Now onto the dashboard. So the dashboard synthesizes extensive wage data on 28 major garment producing countries. It collects feedback from more than 1,400 suppliers across 63 countries and news estimates on sector emissions. Data for each of these metrics is updated on an annual basis, so we can gauge how the industry is progressing and support alignment, encourage information exchange, collaboration, as well as asking bigger, stronger questions about how to support, stimulate, and scale progress to transform the industry. This year's score shows varied progress in the garment industry, with improved scores in some areas and stagnation in others. For this session, we will be diving into the commercial metric, the purchasing practice metric, but keep an eye out for deep dives on the other two metrics later this year. So now into the purchasing practice metric. The metric is based on data gathered by the Better Buying Partnership Index. The survey allows suppliers to rate their buyers' purchasing practices on a scale from 1 to 5. This classifies them into one of the three categories: a true partner, a collaborator, or a detractor. The metric focuses on soft goods. Our purchasing practice metric focuses on the soft goods ratings, which encapsulates the apparel, footwear, and household textile buyers. The survey saw an increase of 21% in total number of ratings received, with suppliers from 63 countries rating 166 buying companies. The score itself comes from a potential range from negative 100 points to positive 100 points, and it has been improving throughout the last few years, starting at 39 points in 2022 to 40 points last year, and now this year we reached 48 points. This shows a gradual but steady improvement, and movement in the right direction. Before diving into some of the highlights of the report, it is worth mentioning that nearly 80% of suppliers are rating preferred partners. This means that the results reflect industry best practices rather than the industry norm. And now on to some insights of the report. So buyers' efforts to improve environmental performance in products and supply chain saw the biggest increase of 12.6% over the previous year. Next to that, we could see a 10% increase in efforts to improve working conditions. Both these increases can be attributed to efforts from buyers to improve their ESG performance on their products, but also within the supply chain. Next to that, also the efficiency of buyers' operational processes increased by 11%. This can be connected to buyers' need to adopt a changing market, an increase in digitalization, as well as having to keep the competitive edge through operational efficiencies. And improvements in partnership, visibility, and stability of buyers' business with suppliers are an encouraging sign, as good practices in these areas contributes to the supplier's long-term businesses. And lastly, overall suppliers particularly valued open dialogue, transparency, and collaborative problem solving. So it would be great to see more of that in the future. But now onto what does this mean for the industry? The industry wants. We see the responsible purchasing practices as an umbrella indicator for change in other social and environmental factors. As we highlighted, the purchasing practice metric has seen a year-on-year improvement, meaning that efforts to implement responsible purchasing practices and engage in constructive sourcing dialogues are increasing. With this logic, these increased efforts should in turn lead to similar improvements in the social and environmental metric. However, we are only observing minimal improvements in both the wages and greenhouse gas metric. This is indicative of the fact that effects of improved purchasing practices will not be felt immediately and will likely not be spread evenly throughout the supply chain. For positive change, positive change will take some time and a lot of collective effort and collaboration to trickle down through the value chain and create lasting positive change on the life of garment workers and our environment. Lastly, we also want to acknowledge that with any metric, the score and the insights of the survey offer a valuable insight and serve as indication on where the industry is heading. It, however, does not reflect the full picture of the lived realities of different actors along the value chain. And this now leads me to why we're here today. With the upcoming panel, we hope to learn more about those realities and what different actors are doing and what we as a sector still need to do to create the industry we want. And now it is my pleasure to hand over to our moderator, Haroon.
Thank you, Hanna, and the industry we want for creating this space to reflect on the state of affairs of the industry and facilitating a dialogue with us to deep dive into the challenges and the opportunities in the garment sector when looking at responsible purchasing practices. As Hanna mentioned, I'm Diaz. I was formerly part of the Industry We Want team and now back again at Fairwear as the lead for responsible purchasing practice. I want to welcome our panelists for today, as you've already heard, but I want to reintroduce them here. Haroon, Shamsi, CEO of Shaheen Industries, sharing insights as a supplier. Lotta, Amsén, Head of Sustainability at Sankavis, here with our brand perspective. Pradeepan, Ravi, Programs Lead at TIWW India, a labor rights organization. Is everything okay? I mute myself, so sorry. Our discussion will seek to discover more about the experiences of our three panelists and their perspectives on the shifts that we are seeing in the way that we do business in the garment industry. Particularly interesting are the developments around the legislative landscape with the forthcoming requirements of the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD, as many of you will know it. We will start by reflecting on some of the key insights from the report. Then we will look at the shifts in the dynamics between the actors in the supply chain, And lastly, discuss the best case scenario and the potential risks with the developments in the policy landscape. So now let's kick off our conversation. And I want to start off with you, Haroon. After hearing from Hanna, but also having read the industry report, can you reflect on the insights that stood out the most to you? And then secondly, in the last 5 years, what are some of the biggest shifts that you have seen in the collaboration and partnership with brands?
Thank you, Karen and Hannah, for giving the briefings and everything. Uh, about the report, the positive thing I observed is trust, actually. The trust between the buyers and the supplier, which leads to increased overall BBPI score, which is a good thing to see. And what I have observed that the best purchasing practices have increased by 23%, which is a good show, I believe. On the other hand, I would like to mention here that hard luck for SMEs, that they fail to attract brands for partnerships, since I can see the larger units have got the partnerships. Now it's time for the brands to build up the capacity of SMEs so that they become also attractive for the partnerships ahead.
Thank you, Haroon.
Oh,
Yes.
and there is another question from you, right? For the last 5 years, right?
Yes.
I would like to, yes, first I'd like to inform the guest here that I am from the home textile sector, and we have two kinds of purchases for our sector. One are the direct brands or the buyers, or the other are the distributors. Brands now after COVID are now very accommodating and giving leverages to their suppliers, which is a good thing to see. And normally their suppliers are, but again, normally the suppliers are large units, and which are like have the advantage of being like they have all the compliances and everything. So I believe the brands feel comfortable with them. And they also, the another thing is it's hard to lose them because it's hard to find the large units as well, because they are just like 10 or 15% of our home textile units. But on the other hand, SMEs are more accommodating to their customers than the large units. Mostly SMEs are supplying to the distributors because of they cannot bear the recurring cost of brands compliances like SEDEX or other things. So they cannot give much leverage to the brands. But what happens that the distributors usually add on their cost as well when they are selling the products to the customers, to the brands in the end. So what we are seeing is that the profits shrinks. That's the profit of SMEs are shrinking, and with the wafer thin profits, it's hard to see that where to invest for these SMEs, because SMEs are run usually by the individuals. So it's hard to see that where to invest the money on the employees or on their own families. So there is something that we need to do, but I would like to end my response on a positive note, which I have heard in a recent GIZ meeting, and that was that I heard that Hugo Boss is planning to monetarily help their suppliers with the buying of raw materials, which I believe may reduce the financial cost of their suppliers, as well as the risk shift towards the brand, which eventually help the supplier to use that money, the financial money amount, in benefits of its employees and the workers' place. That's a big thing I have from the brand. That's wonderful to know.
Yeah, thank you so much, Haroon, for sharing that insight as well. And really hearing from you that there is this interesting distinction between your relation with direct buyers versus distributors, especially as an SME facing some different challenges there. And the fact that the biggest shift is mindset shift, mindset.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then also this risk risk shifting with Hugo Boss is really insightful. Now I want to turn to you, Lotta, and also ask you to briefly reflect on some of these insights that you saw in the industry report. But then can you tell us also, or share a bit more about some of the steps that Sankovist is taking to build trust and collaboration with its suppliers?
Sure. Well, when reading the report, I think, as you also mentioned in the beginning, that we can see that we have a rapid changes in legislation, and I think this actually drives these changes that we see, and of course that's on a positive note. So the increased focus on ESG actually forces the industry actors to exchange more information. And I think with more information coming in both directions, we can build trust, and hopefully it will pave the way for more stable relationships. Because once you start exchanging more information and data, you don't want to have a ton of actors to exchange information with, because it's an administrative burden. So hopefully, I think that the focus on risk minimization and also, of course, investing in those relationships you have will probably, I think, we will see a shift here in order just to maintain those relationships. So I think that, and since the legislation will also force us to report on progress, it's also so important to have these actual dialogues with the suppliers, which I think is very, very important. But of course, I think also that you also mentioned that the KPIs regarding wages and greenhouse gas emissions, that they are maybe dragging a bit behind still. I think that it might implicate that there's still a lack of resources, and also, of course, challenges in terms of regulatory frameworks in these sourcing countries that actually hinders us to achieve this transformation this fast. So more resources is still needed from all sides here in order to really reach that transformation. But your second question regarding what we can do here and now, I think for Sandqvist, we are a small brand. we're a bag brand, which actually says something about what kind of assortment we have. But we are really working with shared planning. So for us, it's so important. We only have 2 first-tier suppliers that should be mentioned, but it's important for us to have a really long-term design strategy and to really plan way ahead of each collection. So in order for us to achieve, for example, full confirmation on production capacity and of course also the ability for our lower tier suppliers to ship the materials by boat instead of flying it, we need to have like a full timeline that is confirmed before we even place the order. So this goes along with, of course, a close dialogue with the supplier to always keep ourselves informed, because as a small brand, we also know that the capacity and the factories will shift if a big order comes in, and that is beyond our control. So we always need to keep ourselves informed of what these kind of changes would mean in terms of our production, since we have such small leverage. And important things to say here as well is also that in our contracts we state that we want to share the financial risk with the supplier, and this also goes into the planning. So we take financial liability of all the material if it's not used in coming collections, which also means something for, of course, for the design team. That we have a large bulk of carryovers, for example, because we have to use the material that is in stock. Of course, we also have stated in the contracts that we want to see open costing, just to ensure that that we have a full cost breakdown for each product, so that we never negotiate on labor costs, for example. If something doesn't meet our target price, we can collaboratively redesign the bag together with the supplier. Then, well, practically it means that we maybe take away some trim because then it would then lower the cost of the product. So, but of course, this takes time. And I think that is a thing that I want to mention here, that long-term planning is actually, I think, the key here. And that also means that we want to have stable relationships, because otherwise the planning is for no use. So we can't shift supplier that easily.
Thank you, Lotta. You've mentioned here a lot of really, really important information, and information that I would say is also quite reflective of the common framework on responsible purchasing practices, which is this reference point that a group of MSIs developed in the last 2 years, and that we really see are representing some of the key principles that brands need to be integrating into this new way of doing business. And I think that you really hone down on some of those important points, including long-term planning and long-term relations with suppliers. So thank you for that. Now, I do want to turn to Pradeepan and ask you as well, can you reflect on the key insights that stood out the most to you from the industry report? I know that you do not speak on behalf of workers, but as a labor rights organization, you do work very closely with trade unions and also aim to address and raise awareness about working conditions in our supply chain. So it would be also interesting to understand from your perspective, what changes have you seen in working conditions that reflect a brand having better purchasing practices with its suppliers?
First of all, a big thanks to the organizers for inviting TIWW to be part of this panel. The report has come at a very critical juncture, and yeah, this is quite important that we discuss it now. To the question of what stood out for me in this report, I would say the biggest contribution of initiatives like the industry we want is that they highlight the core issue which drives poor working conditions in supply chain. That is the contracting practices adopted by brands. It's encouraging to see that more suppliers participate in the survey each year, providing feedback on key contracting practices and their relationship with brands as well. This feedback is crucial not only for suppliers, but also for workers in the supply chain. However, the process shouldn't stop here. It's essential to understand how brands interpret this data and plan to engage with their suppliers on key aspect of their relationships, which need significant improvements. So, for example, the stability of buyers' business with suppliers, if you look into the report, it received low scores. So this is a significant concern because the interests of workers and communities are also tied to these factors. So the steps brands take to address these are vital, and real change starts from this point, I would say, for us. Also, the findings show 10% increase in buyers' efforts to improve working conditions. At the outset, it looks positive and encouraging, but we want to know what are these efforts and how it impacted the working conditions. We do not know which aspect of working conditions improved as a result of these efforts. So all these are quite important. It will be great if the report also covers these aspects that I mentioned. Going back to the specific question you asked me about what changes we observed in working conditions vis-a-vis brand practices, I would say not much has changed regarding working conditions or workers' everyday experiences in their workplaces. Initiatives like the industry we want are promising and should be encouraged, but we haven't seen significant shifts in how brands approach contracting practices so far. So despite our regular interactions with workers, we hardly see any evidence of change. I would specifically want to talk about a study that CIWW conducted in 2023 to develop a human rights due diligence approach for the Indian garment industry. We gathered data from 600 garment workers and 27 suppliers across 3 garment clusters in India. Workers provided insights on 5 major human rights and labor rights risks they face, which includes wage insufficiency, informality in the employment, discrimination, freedom of association, and so on. Simultaneously, we also collected data from suppliers on various aspects of contracting practices, such as contractual classes, lead time, pricing strategies, and so on. Through the study, we argue that human rights risks constitute both risks from contracting practices and risks to workers. So both of these must be addressed for HRDD to be meaningful and have a positive impact on working conditions. So in the report, we intentionally referred to purchasing practices as contracting practices because the relationship between the brand and the supplier is one of contracted production rather than just a buyer-seller relation in arm's length purchases. So this understanding is quite critical for us. The study findings clearly show that industry performs poorly in all identified risk areas. Moreover, it established a link between poor labor outcomes in workplaces and contracting practices. For instance, our study highlighted the non-payment of minimum and living wages is tied to brands setting contracts based on national minimum wages for labor costs. So I would say that is, Haroon and Lotta mentioned about gradual change that is happening, but there is a lot to be done. So brands need to look within and change their practices to support their suppliers and in turn the workers in the supply chain. Yeah.
Thank you, Pradeepan. And I think that is really important for us to keep that pulse on the issue, because we are working on a hypothesis indeed that looks at purchasing practices as the key lever. However, how much time? And that is something that Lotta also mentioned very adequately. It is about forming these long-term relations, and that in itself will need to happen across several years for it to really have that impact that we're hoping for on a working level. Now, that really brings us to the next part of our conversation. I would really like us to pivot, and it has been raised several times now, to legislation. As mentioned, TIWW is part of a new generation of sector norms and public regulation that signals a shift from the failing conventional model that we have been discussing here, and that Pradeepan also, I think, contextualized quite well, to the fundamentals of shared supply chain responsibility and what we now recognize as the process of human rights and environmental due diligence, or HREDD. Now, the HREDD framework is a framework for protecting workers, suppliers, and communities from harm and holding businesses to account. Within HREDD, brands must actively take responsibility to respect human rights, mitigate environmental impacts, and also remedy harms in their supply chain. This implies a collaboration with manufacturers as opposed to the offloading responsibility to them. It is well known across the industry, and that is what we are hypothesizing here, that when brands adopt responsible purchasing practices, suppliers are able to plan production effectively, manage working hours, pay workers fairly, and invest in improving labor conditions. Indeed, it is only when brands adopt these responsible purchasing practices that we see that HREDD can be implemented impactfully. Now, turning back to our panelists, Haroon, what opportunities do you see in the current policy landscape to enhance suppliers' leverage?
Thank you, Karin. The due diligence policy is beacon of light for SMEs and for the whole industry as well. And it is also a beacon of light for the buyers as well, so that they will get the better product because of the investment in the labor in the employees. The public is well aware of the labor rights, human rights, and all the environmental issues. So now the buyers are bound to fulfill their commitment with the community, which eventually leads to the increase in sales of those brands. Actually, that is what we are here for, to increase the sales, to increase the profitability, and to gain on both sides, right? The laborers and the brands as well. And to fulfill their commitment, buyer will need to have the supplier in due diligence and by the means of capacity building and other resources. And the supplier obviously will invest in employees as well, which will eventually bring the good product, good production, as well as I believe, the working environment. And so I believe that due diligence policy is a win-win situation for both the buyers and the supplier, as well as the employees as well. It's a win-win situation for all of us.
Thank you. It's good to know that the best case scenario of this legislation is a win-win scenario. Now I want to turn to you, Lotta, and ask you the same question. What opportunities do you see in the current policy landscape to enhance brands' practices?
Well, I see that one huge opportunity is to enhance the collaboration between brands, but also between various partners along the supply chain. Because I think that working together with others that wanting to achieve the same goals here is crucial. I mean, we are, as many brands, we are quite small. We're an SME, and in order to actually achieve something, we must see more widespread practices across the whole industry. Not to cause extra administrative work for the supplier, for example. So this actually, of course, entails capacity building at the supplier level, and I think that is already happening. But here we also, when trying to change things, it's a bit maybe sometimes shaky in the beginning, and of course, if it's outside the usual norm of the suppliers, how they, for example, how they construct their costing of the products. I mean, that we need to stipulate how we want to see it, but if no one else wants to see it the same way, it's something that it has to be done outside of their system. So with more buyers wanting to see the same data, and that comes to, I mean, it's all the different data points here that needs to be streamlined, which are happening now, since we see that the same things are requested for us to be reported on. I think that there is we will see that we have to speak with of course together with other brands, just to see that we can work together on these things. And another thing that I think that we will see is a movement towards maybe a slimmer supply base for many brands. We will probably see with enhanced requirements in terms of due diligence and sourcing. We will see that probably suppliers that cannot provide data, or that where we can see that once we do all these due diligence tasks to actually verify the statements, we might see that the bar is raised also for suppliers. And this is just to achieve a greater transparency. So I think in the long run, we will see more stable relationships, but the bar is raised for everyone. So maybe also a slimmer supply base in order to just cope with all the data requirements.
Thank you, Lotta. Yeah, I do see it as well. Greater collaboration, greater transparency, and ultimately a less fragmented garment industry. Now, moving to Pradeepan, what are some of the opportunities that you see in the current policy landscape to enhance worker rights?
Yes. Karen, as you mentioned, we are witnessing many changes in the policy landscape, both internationally and at the national level as well. So recent developments such as the CSDDD and the German Supply Chain Act are significant victories that way. They are also outcomes of the long struggle of workers and civil society. So these new legislation at the EU level mark a shift from what you call as voluntary measures to mandatory requirements for human rights due diligence, which also emphasizes the responsibilities of the lead firms, which in my point of view is a significant leap forward. Earlier, we had the UNGPs and OECD guidelines for multinational companies, which were not binding on the companies. Now, these new laws are binding on companies and they are accountable for any negative impacts on workers and communities. So that way, these are very significant. However, much depends on how these policies are going to be translated into action. These instruments provide opportunities for the brands to reflect on their practices and their responsibilities. And as a CSO, as a civil society organization, we want to see shift in their reliance on what we call social audits, which focus a lot on compliance and puts onus on the suppliers. But HRDD, as we know, is quite different. It is about risks and impacts that workers and communities face. So both the process of identifying risks and ways of addressing them are quite important. It's quite different from what we usually do. The emphasis on meaningful stakeholder engagement is crucial in the HRDD approach. As you know, freedom of association and collective bargaining rights are often constrained in the areas where we work, making stakeholder engagement even more significant for us. It will be important to see how, in this instance, how brands approach stakeholder engagement and which stakeholders they choose to engage with. There is clearly an opportunity for brands to do things differently and meaningfully when it comes to HRDD. The biggest concern, however, is that many companies are not covered within the scope of the legislation. We need to wait and see whether the obligations on larger companies will create a domino effect, as many say, and bring about changes in the practices of the smaller company as well. So at last, another concern I want to highlight is the lack of recognition of contracting practices and its impact on workers and communities within the legislation. It's very important for HRDD processes to identify risks arising out of contracting practices and poor labor outcomes for workers and address both of these simultaneously. The human rights risk cannot be seen in isolation of contracting practices, but the legislation does not recognize this. So we have to wait and watch how things unfold.
Thank you, Pradeepan. Yeah, and obviously I recognize that as well. Of course, there are a lot of discussions about supportive measures to the CSDDD, like sector guidelines that could help clarify some of these possible concerns. And I also agree that one of the biggest opportunities here is creating a new norm around meaningful stakeholder engagement. Now that we've actually looked at the best case scenario of this legislation, I do want us to turn to some of the potential risk associated and also discuss some proactive strategies for mitigating them. So coming to you, Haroon, first, how do you collaborate with brands to set the groundwork for due diligence and improved sourcing dialogue? And how do you circle those efforts back potentially to these forthcoming compliance requirements around CSDDD?
Thank you, Karen. Since we all are the humans, right? And it is our responsibility to think about the humans and the working conditions and everything. Because how I live, I wanted my other fellows to live like me. So one thing is, we all need to work on it. But for me, as you wanted to ask me, how is it? So as an SME, currently I am not reached by my buyers to adopt EU CSDDD. As far as I know, currently with 5,000 or 10,000 employees, the companies with 5,000 or 10,000 employees are asked to adopt the directives. The time given by EU to be taken as an omen by the SMEs and try to build their capacity, because by 2027 or I believe 2030, this EU CSDDD will be complied by all, whoever is exporting to or working in EU. To tell you the truth, Karen, I am frightened. I'm unable to understand how the SMEs will cater the increased cost of compliance. You know that with SEDEX, BCSI, OCOTEX, it is not mandatory, but EU legislatives will be mandatory to all. But the good thing is SEDEX and other compliances are kind of a recurring cost. And in due diligence case is different, right? We didn't have a recurring cost, but the initial investment in to bring the change in supply line and to cater the better work conditions for our employees will definitely increase initially will increase the cost of our products, which in long run maybe will be adjusted, but sustaining the system will be a big challenge for SMEs. But once we are into it, I believe things will start working on. Another point I like to ponder, that buyers should help building the capacity of SMEs to get the due diligence directives adopted. This is something we need to work on because the capacity is limited for the SMEs. Since I am an SME, so that's why I can tell you that. Thank you.
Thank you, Haroon. And also really important indeed to note that one of the biggest areas that brands can help or support in understanding and raising awareness of the new need of due diligence in relation to this legislation is for building capacity and understanding what that means. And now I want to turn to Lotta. In light of the EU CSDDD, how is Sankovis identifying and reducing HREDD risks to follow a risk-based approach?
Again, I think it's important to say that we have quite a streamlined assortment, which means that we don't work with that many actors. So even when we speak about the lower tiers, it makes sense from a business perspective to not use as many materials. So and the key to this to achieve like a good risk-based approach is of course traceability. So when we speak about the actual bag, we don't have that many components. We have many components, but it comes from like not that many sources. So working with certifications when it comes to the materials, where we can see a traceable supply chain is very important for us to achieve this information exchange, I would say. So having direct contact also with lower tier suppliers will be increasingly important for everyone to understand, and of course also nominate even more materials, I think is important. Even though we don't have contracts with the low tier suppliers, we can still exchange information to understand the situations on the ground. So when the need for more data comes, we already have these relationships that we can tap into, and I think that would be important for the whole industry. And when it comes to, of course, these specific risk preventive actions we do, I can just say that for the suppliers where we have a higher leverage, meaning our first tier suppliers where we have direct relations, we are focusing on some of the things that we know will drive drive change, such as increasing wages, for example, and understanding, again, based on open costing, we understand how much that will mean on product level. And I think that is also something that will be important for more actors, as we know that there are some points that are more relevant than others in order to decrease risks. And wages is, of course, one of them, which also makes it natural for this initiative to track the development in terms of wages. But then when it comes to greenhouse gases, we are working in the same way, I would say, identifying the hotspots where we know where our main emissions lies, trying to, through the dialogues with the different suppliers, try to support the suppliers in energy efficiency programs, for example, trying to give them some incentives. I mean, energy efficiency is one of the things that we can do, but we know that we also have to phase out other things, such as coal-fired boilers, for example. That is more tricky, but it also comes down to capacity building. Getting the suppliers or all the actors in the supply chain to understand the return on investments on different emitting technologies. And I think that is still a journey that many has to take. So building capacity in terms of environmental management, and highlighting where things could be different, which also could be beneficial from a financial and environmental perspective. But it all comes down to this, I would say, dialogues and traceability in order to achieve this.
Thank you, Lotta. Yes, so a lot more information sharing is what I'm hearing in order to start mitigating risks, but also looking at these two very important topics. And I think that was quite nice for you to bring in wages, because wages is an enabler of other human rights. Exactly. So it is really an important leverage point. Now I'm going to swiftly move on to Pradeepan, because we are slightly over time, but considering there are not that many questions from the audience, I think we can take up the space. But Pradeepan, what support do you need from brands and policymakers to create a more conducive environment for better working conditions, both environmentally and socially?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. So what is important for us to see here is that the brands and suppliers have common but differentiated responsibilities, in addressing human rights and labor rights risks faced by workers and communities as well. So the risk, the whole, when it comes to the legislation, we see is that the responsibility to manage and mitigate the risks could be passed on to the suppliers. So that is a risk we see. It is quite important that capacity building and awareness raising is important around the concept of human rights due diligence, but brands should also come forward to cover the costs involved, in identifying and addressing the risks, while there is the supplier responsibility to implement the required standards. So the connection between poor working conditions and brands' contracting practices is quite clear. Brands need to acknowledge this and commit to working with relevant stakeholders, including workers and their representatives, to tackle these issues. Policies are important, but what we really need are concrete actions and tangible results. For workers, this means better wages, safe and violence-free workplaces, and the ability to exercise their right to freedom of association and collective bargaining. Brands should also report their progress in these areas and how they measure it, measure the. I'm sorry. Okay.
Thank you. We lost you there briefly, very briefly at the end. You went mute.
Okay. So as I mentioned before, the situation around the freedom of association in most of the production countries is worrying. So in these cases, who the brands consider as workers' representatives and how they engage with them are very important factors that will determine the effectiveness of HRDD process. As a civil society organization working to improve workers' rights, we are really concerned about that. And you also asked me about what we need from the policymakers. So when it comes to the state's role, the current legislation doesn't seem to include a way to assess progress, assess impact. There should be some kind of monitoring to track how things are improving. We already know the key risks in various sectors. So the state should actively monitor any progress. Otherwise, the legislation will risk being similar to social auditing mechanisms, which has not been quite useful for workers. So the policymakers need to ensure there are effective mechanisms for monitoring the implementation of the legislation, and the progress should also be publicly reported. The state also needs to ensure there is multi-stakeholder engagement and dialogue on key issues of workers and communities. And this should not be left to businesses and civil society organizations to handle or to lead. So there is still a lot to be done at various levels to ensure that the legislation truly improves the working and living conditions of workers. Yeah.
Thank you, Pradeepan. And also, you've mentioned contracting practices a couple of times. I want to point everyone here to the Responsible Contracting Project and learning more about some of the tools that they've developed to help address some of these issues that you are mentioning as well. And I fully agree that in the transposition of this legislation, it is really important for national governments to considering how they are going to be monitoring and reviewing the cases that do come in related to these due diligence issues. Now, I want to thank our speakers for this moderated part of the discussion and just finish off with a couple of words. Although brands rarely have direct control over their production sites, as we've heard here, they still bear the responsibility to help facilitate good working conditions. This is becoming even more necessary with these legislative developments and are making HREDD mandatory. As said, human rights and environmental due diligence and responsible purchasing practices really go hand in hand. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Hanna, who is going to be facilitating the Q&A last 5 minutes of this panel. Thank you so much to the speakers and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you to our panelists and moderator today for an incredibly thought-provoking and rich discussion. And thank you also to everyone who took their time out of their day to be here today and sending all of the questions. And sorry that we didn't make it to get to all of them. But feel free to email us if you have any outstanding questions. You can find that on our website. You can also, again, visit our website for more information on these metrics and follow us on social media to stay up to date on when the next deep dives are going to happen and any other updates on the metrics. And the next update to the dashboard will be in early 2025, so we can continue reporting on the progress or lack thereof that the industry is making. Again, thank you everyone for being here, and to our moderator, to our panelists, I really appreciate the time you've taken out of your day. And with that, I'll send you off into your days, and yeah, stay in touch and email us if you have any questions you'd like to ask.